we come to the future of the Auckland Dockline tram. So could I ask, please, Paula Collar, Connie Clarkson and David Rankin, all from Panuku, to come to the table. Normally at this stage I would pro forma move the recommendation, but I'm suggesting we don't move the recommendation at this point till we've heard the presentation, because as you may have heard, David, some of us have foreshadowed that we're not sure that actually the decision Panuku has come to is the best of the options, but I would like to hear your presentation before I move or accept from somebody else an amendment to our recommendation. So you've got a presentation to give. We look forward to that, and then at the end of that presentation I'll open it up for questions and then comment.
Yeah, I was really going to make a few introductory comments rather than a presentation there, but we do have some visuals if needed, because it's probably more constructive to go to questions and deal with issues that councillors want to raise. But just to introduce the item, the Panuku board's obviously had some serious thought and discussion about this item when it first started to come up, and then in considering and approving the report you have on this agenda. And while there are lots of dimensions to this and, you know, endless numbers and things, I thought it would be most helpful if I simply run through what the Panuku board saw as the essential logic of this at the end of the day in terms of the basis of its decision anyway. And I suppose to start with, Mayor, is to make the point that the recommendation is not driven from some belief that this service has got no value or is not appreciated by anybody. We accept that it does have some users, it's got a passionate stakeholder group. So to the Panuku board, this came down really to a matter of priorities, because as you all know, we are in a constrained resource environment. Panuku has a lot of demands on its resources in the waterfront, more so now with the impact of all the impacts of AC36, and also we're trying to build momentum across the suburban locations as well, which we would like to have more to invest in, but we're making the best of the resources we have. And so I suppose the first bit of the logic was to understand in the prioritising debate that this is not really a discussion, a priorities discussion about transport. This service was implemented early in the life of Waterfront Auckland after amalgamation, and it was put in on the basis that it was a place activation initiative. If you all recall, at the time the waterfront 2011, 2012 looked very different from it is today in terms of activation, things going on, development. And while there was at that point a lot of debate going on around, you know, as you've heard today, tram service from Wynyard through to Britomart and a lot of other things debated, the cold reality is that there was never a plan emerge that was agreed to by anybody, let alone funded, to provide such a transport service. And as we sit here today, as the Panuku board sat here when it considered this recently, there is no foreseeable prospect of such a service being funded in reality. The plans as we know them for light rail, as it will be for the waterfront, which are being evolved by NZTA now following the change of government, almost certainly will involve at some point a tram line along Fanshawe Street, and as we are advised, not through the waterfront itself. The location of where that line might enter the waterfront will be determined by decisions yet to be made about a third harbour crossing. So the board considered this in the reality that this should be viewed as a place activation event, and its merits and priorities should be seen on that basis, and not confused with thinking that somehow this is a transport service. You only need to look at the loop, even imagining it's recreated, to see that it doesn't perform some key east-to-west transport function. And as I say, there is no prospect that that's in store for it. We were faced with the need to relocate the tracks with the replacement work AT is doing on the road and the ongoing development. Ideally, this issue would have come up with more time, but in our view, it wouldn't have altered the options and the choices and the decisions. And so while there are a range of options that you have in the report in front of you, the Panuku board view is that in truth there are only two options. One is the one that's recommended, and the other one is to go to full reinstatement through and post AC36. Because the reality of an interim option basically comes down to the fact that unless you subsequently go on and spend the rest of the money, you've effectively wasted a lot of the money that you're putting in the view of the Panuku board. And secondly, the practical time that this service will operate between now and AC36 is constrained because of all the physical work going on. And as noted in the report, the events steering group for AC36 does not want the tram operating during the peak periods of the event in any case, which we can cover more in questions if you like. So we don't see a particularly strong case for the investment to take it through to AC36. The risk is that that money, you're either wasting it or you're effectively taking another slice of a salami, and in fact, in the board's view, there should be a realism about the fact that if we spend another couple of $1 million, the true impact of this when we come to having this discussion again down the track a bit is that we'll be spending the rest of it. So the board felt it was important to be clear what we're committing to here in this context of how big a priority is it. And so that goes to the heart then of the debate, looking at all the activation that has taken place in the waterfront at considerable public expense and with private development since 2011, looking at what you've already committed to over the next 3 or 4 years, looking at what is not yet in the LTP but is ahead of us, things like the iconic Wynyard Point open space that will be expensive to create. The Panuku board struggled to see the expenditure of $5 million, well, 6 if you count what's already in a budget, as a priority for the waterfront. It felt if it was doing its job and the governing body said you've got $5 million more for place activation for the waterfront, that would not be how it was used. We'd far rather it was used, for example, for Wynyard Point. And that's before you get into the debate and consideration for the Panuku board of, well, what about if there is $5 million for activation, or $2 million for that matter, should it really be going here, or should it be going to the suburban locations where we are probably under investing still in place activation, even with the funding package we achieved from the LTP. So the board felt in doing its job, the best robust advice it could give the governing body is this is a place activation priorities discussion. It does not, to our board, stack up as a priority. We would rather prioritise that money for something else if it is available, whether that's on the waterfront or whether it is in one of our suburban locations. So that's probably all we need to say by way of introduction, Mayor, and we're happy to answer questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. Look, can I just lead off on it? I take a different view. I don't think there are only two options, and we're certainly not looking at spending $5.9 million here. What I think we're looking at, and I want you to comment on, is a general view that with all of the development happening around Wynyard Quarter and Wynyard Point, actually we would like to see, at a relatively low cost, a testing of what the public appetite is for an historic tramway in that region. And my question is this: is it, when we look at the fact that we had up to 52,000 passengers per month at one stage, why would you rule out the potential future use of an historic tramway if you haven't given it a fair trial first, without the interruptions of the track removals and the building that's occurring around there at the moment? Because your option 4 kills it stone dead. Your option 2 involves a lot of money for CapEx investment, but option 3 gives you the chance to trial whether there is much greater potential than what we have realised in this tram line now. Could I get your response to that, please?
Look, the Panuku board would certainly respect any decision by the governing body to allocate a higher priority to this and the funding. So let's make that clear. But because this is a values judgment on priorities. But basically, as I said, the issue from the board's perspective is that if this is to have a future, then the true cost of it is not the $2 million in option 3. Option 3 gets you a limited time operation in reality between now and the event, and strong advice from the event steering committee they don't want it running during the peak periods of the event. Having spent a couple of $1 million, you then go, let's imagine we wind the clock forward, we're here in 2020 and we've spent that extra $2 million. The reality is to keep it going, because of the ongoing development, and as always envisaged, there will need to be a relocation of the tram shed, which will lead inevitably to the sort of expenditure we've estimated as best as we can in the option. You're right, Mayor, if an advantage of running it will be to determine how much interest there is in it. That's a valid point to make. But where that leads to will still be the end financial obligation. It will be a limited time. I mean, in a sense, it getting a fair crack as a trial, even in the compressed period, is a little bit of a question. And we still come back to the fact that there already has been a lot of activation on the waterfront since this was put in. You're already funding a lot more between now and the AC36 event. The AC36 event itself is requiring considerable investment by Auckland Council. We're going, do you really need this, or is there a better way to use the money?
Okay, I'm going to lead by advantage and only ask example, and only ask one question. We now have a range of other questions that are on my list. Councillor Casey.
David, I have a specific question. When a member of the public comes before this council and accuses us through one of its CCOs of secrecy, it always puts my antennae up. And I want to ask you about the paragraph in your report where you say that only 6 months ago your attention was brought to the encroachment by the tram line, and the allegation and the response from the public is that you knew back in 2014 and that you've been keeping it a secret from both the public and from us as the governing body of Auckland Council. Could you respond to that?
Yeah. So first of all, there is absolutely nothing secret about the fact that site by site, the job of the previous Waterfront Auckland and now Panuku is to, in line with the waterfront plan, which was widely consulted and strongly supported, take sites to the market for development. And you saw another one here recently for Site 18. It's just one of a number that has already taken place, and there are a number more to come to fully deploy what's in the waterfront plan. So there is absolutely no secrecy about the fact that's the strategy which is being executed. The process of seeking development partners is not secret. You go out in the market, most of them have actually been extensively advertised. But of course, as you would expect, what is secret are the negotiations which we carry on with the developer party before we reach an agreement, at which point, to one extent or another, certainly the existence of the party and what's being sold to them is made public. often the prices, you know, you all know that. So there was no secrecy about any of that. The issue that you're more specifically alluding to, Councillor, is in reality what happened in 2014 by staff at the then Waterfront Auckland was that there was a discussion around realigning the boundary of what is known, without getting into too much detail, of West 1 and West 2, which is like a block. The development agreement is with the same developer, so it wasn't by moving the boundary that developer got a deal at the expense of someone else. It's the same developer buying the block. There are simply two stages. The then Waterfront Auckland looked at the map, and I think it's self-evident when you look at it that the way the initial boundary lines were wasn't giving you two logical development blocks that would achieve the best design outcomes for the waterfront. So an agreement was reached within that block to realign the boundary. Now, for reasons that we're unable to ascertain, the truth of it is that it wasn't apparent at the time. It would appear that was going to clash with the tram line, and so it simply wasn't escalated as an issue. And so the truth of the matter is, as in the report, it surfaced as an issue earlier this year, and we then started to deal with it. I'd make the bigger point, Councillor, that right from the very start, it was always acknowledged that the role of this service and its route wasn't permanent. It would be dependent on the rollout of development. And it was always clear, as far as Waterfront Auckland was concerned, that the primary consideration wasn't going to be about moving a tram line, it was about getting the best development outcomes from a place perspective on the waterfront. So that's what happened literally. It wasn't escalated earlier, but effectively all it means is that we would have been having this discussion and facing these funding choices earlier than we now are. And we'd be as happy about that as anyone, but that's not how it's worked out.
Okay, Councillor Wayne.
Just to be clear, just a supplementary to that. So just to be clear then, David, only 6 months ago you learned about the tram. 6 months ago.
I think that's correct.
April,
April
2018.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So when Panuku says...
And the reason it got triggered is because the development partner, having done earlier phases, you all know Willis Bond has been doing earlier stages. They got to that stage, the current staff started working with them and found this issue.
So you can categorically deny that you decided back in 2014 to shelve the tram?
There's no record of any such decision, and as someone who's been involved in the waterfront since the organisations were amalgamated, and senior staff who were with Waterfront Auckland weren't aware of this either. So the best conclusion you can reach is that when it was agreed at the time, there wasn't the realisation that the redrawing of the boundary, for what I say are completely logical reasons, would cause the problem. However, the problem was always going to arise because these tracks were always subject to the rollout of development sites, and so we would have just known about it and made these choices earlier.
Okay, Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Got a few questions.
Sorry, Wayne, Councillor Walker, can you just limit it to one plus a potential supplementary if it's pressing? I do want to cover the ground.
So I've got a question around paragraph 31, which is the America's Cup Steering Group has advised the trams could be a hazard and hindrance. What information supports that, given that cars and buses and lime scooters and bikes could conceivably constitute an even bigger hazard than something that's running on a fixed line that's got an operator and a bell and all sorts of health and safety issues and doesn't go that fast?
I think that's a very good question.
I was just checking with Paula. Oh, by the way, Mayor, I was remiss. Paula is the person, the manager in our team who's been handling this issue, and Connie is the manager responsible for this service, I think, since it started, and for the
Just since Panuku.
Panuku and of the staff member. So we accepted written advice from the events steering group, which is a mixture of Crown officials, ETNZ, I think some council group represented, ATEED, that from an event safety perspective, this is a situation where the event and the audience are all going to be collected, together in a very concentrated space, and that from a safety perspective, it would be requesting that this did not operate. Yeah. I would imagine, given health and safety laws and their accountability for running the event, that we would be following that advice. So we don't have any detail behind that, but to me, or to us, it makes intuitive sense that this is going to be a very congested area. Those of you that were here previous events will know how crowded those spaces get when the race days happen.
Okay, so one other question. You mentioned.
Do you want to follow that up as a supplementary, Councillor?
Well, just a related question, and it just goes to the report to the board. So has the board of Panuku had any report that's considered a number of things put forward, like a leveraged transaction, a different operational model, the costings that we've seen, for example, from the community based on quotes, consideration of market statistics around the future population numbers that are going to be resident in Wynyard Quarter and the general catchment of the tram that might lead to other thoughts around the success of the operation?
So the Panuku board is aware, as is set out in this report, that we had some design options. There was a fourth option that came from the stakeholder group. We went to experienced quantity surveyors who are doing work on this roadway now for Auckland Transport. At the request of the stakeholder group, our board is aware that we then had that peer reviewed. Ironically, the peer reviewer's conclusion was that the first set of numbers were too conservative given the inherent risk with this sort of work, and so suggested we should in fact put a more realistic cost in. So the board of Panuku is of a mind that these are a reliable set of numbers and that there's no grounds in reality for more wishful thinking. And in fact, if I was to sort of characterise our board view, it would be these are the classic projects where numbers in reality tend to go up when you start work, not down. The board is comfortable that these figures are as realistic as you can professionally obtain. In terms of projected usage, no, we didn't go into that. The board did hear from Paneet and others around their view that, similar to what you've heard today, the board's view was, look, who knows, but they sound very high optimistic projections. I don't think any of us, including the board, know of any services like this in the world that operate at a profit. And so the reality is the big cost is the CapEx, and then in all probability, I think our board will review there will be an ongoing operating deficit. It's just a case of how big it is.
Okay, thank you. Just before I come to the next question, I was hoping Councillor Walker would ask the supplementary about the hazard and the hindrance during the World Cup event. I think if a claim like that's going to be made, we need it to be backed up with a bit more substance than what's in the report, because I'm not sure what the hazard and the hindrance is, frankly. But you may have some information that I don't have. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, if you're limiting the questions, it's going to be a bit tough for me to figure out which of my questions to ask, but I'll give it a go. My personal opinion is your report actually puts a whole lot of doubt on your organisation, which I think is a big shame. You changed the site was changed, the trams were there first, the site was changed, you ripped them up. We have a no surprises approach. My question is, why has this come now? You had an end of year report, didn't know about it. We've had the first quarter report, didn't know about it. Now this Willis Bond residential development is due for construction this month, and it's on the agenda now. What happened to the no surprises?
Yes, Councillor, I think I've covered the issue of changing the boundaries when the trams were there first. The trams were envisaged from the start as being not necessarily, in fact, almost certainly not, to be permanently located as first laid down. Its future role and route was unclear. I alluded to the debate around it eventually forming a link to Britomart, so I won't go into that anymore. This issue as first emerged, it looked a small problem at first. There were initially overly optimistic figures we received that we could keep this going at relatively minor cost, in which case we would have done so for some sort of period. As the staff involved went more and more into the actual costs with all this, it became clear to us there was a growing budget issue. I can't remember the exact point, but under the no surprises policy, at the appropriate time that was shaped up sufficiently, Panuku utilised those routes to advise there was an issue. It actually took some months for us to reliably establish a set of numbers that we had confidence in, and we think we've shared those, including with the stakeholder groups, fairly early on.
So if I may, a supplementary,
Yeah,
Your Worship,
supplementary to that.
because I have asked a question of the presenters, and I feel it's appropriate for me to ask the same question. Point 14 of your report, second sentence, you state that you have engaged with the supporter groups and have considered, analysed and have peer reviewed the costs of all the options put on the table. That's been challenged by the presenters. You've heard what they've said. What's your response to that?
So we do consider that we have engaged with the stakeholders. So under attachment A, there's a 2-page response which outlines all the correspondence and the meetings that we have had with the stakeholders. In terms of the options, all of the options have been costed and peer reviewed. In terms of the costs themselves, we have confidence in those figures, and the reason for that is that the QS that was used to do those figures had analysed the rates in the AT contract. So that contract includes the removal and the reinstatement of the tram lines, and those rates are as recent as June of this year.
I hate to do this, Your Worship, but the point, there's a different view between the two groups, Panuku and the people who presented to us. We have a list of correspondence, so I just have to ask, if they still think you haven't peer reviewed the options, have you in all this correspondence, because all I've got here is the fact that you have communicated, I don't know what you've said, could you tell them?
Yes, so we have shared the information with the stakeholders, so our reports have gone to those stakeholders, and we have also shared the options and the costings. In terms of if there may be a disagreement, it may be that with the permanent relocation, that information wasn't peer reviewed. And that's just a high level estimate. So that's relating to, so when we talk about all the options, we're talking about all the realignment options.
Okay, I reserve my
Thank you. I'm just trying to encourage councillors to work out what their most important question is, and then to follow up, if need be, with a supplementary to that, so we can get through our business a little bit more efficiently than we did the other day when we're still here at 9 p.m. Next question is Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll try and do that. My first one is a very quick yes or no one, just to clarify some of the other councillors' questions. So in the any agreements with Willis Bond, there's no actual reference to removing tracks in any of those papers?
No.
Okay. My question that goes, my proper question, goes to the comments made on heritage and the view that's been taken by the Panuku board, and particularly the suggestion that the trams could be turned into a hot dog stand type thing. I just wonder what view the board took in terms of the preservation of living heritage and how that might be important to the people of Auckland in their deliberations.
So the trams which are owed, the option that we've actually been working on over the last 2 months is an agreement with Motat to take them over and to transfer over the staff member. There was an idea at one point to use at least one of the trams and make an activation thing of it by having some sort of cafe, which is not uncommon overseas. However, I think probably we've concluded that Motat's interest in it is the best route. More broadly with heritage, there's an issue about, well, how much is a waterfront service in that location? How much really is that heritage? There was a tram barn there for the city service, but there wasn't actually a tram service operating.
Yes,
so
there was. Yes, there was, David.
So the key thing is the actual trams themselves, and I've answered that piece of it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Richard Hills.
Thank you, Chair. I did have many questions, but I'll focus on the transport side. So I wasn't here, I've only been here 2 years, so kind of, to me, everything else was, I don't know the information and what's come before then. But my concern is, and the suggestion, so there is 2 trams, right? Am I correct?
So there's actually 3 trams, but in the last few years there's only been 1 that's operational.
Okay. And the suggestion that it be transport, so this, you guys aren't transport, but I have to ask you the questions because you're here. So a suggestion that it becomes the transport mode for the Wynyard Quarter, but that would, I assume, take the, even to 7 to 7 services through 7 days would take up the hours needed on those 2 trams to 168, so you're talking over $200,000 worth of employing just the drivers?
Well, I think the big point, Councillor, is Auckland Transport has never accepted that as a transport function, and there's never been a plan agreed to by anyone that it has a transport function. And if you look at the main movement of people, as we all know, is east-west, and that's why it was a valid idea back in 2011 to think about a link from there back to Britomart. If someone had been prepared to fund that, and that was the agreed strategy, that had a certain logic to it. But not only has that never been agreed, it's never been funded, and as I said in my introductory comments, all the thinking now and our updated information from NZTA is that the light rail that everyone is talking about will be along Fanshawe Street and will go through the waterfront at some point that'll be determined by the location of the Third Harbour Crossing. So Auckland Transport is very clear and has provided that, confirmed that for us in writing. This has no transport function, and that's what we told our board.
And so the
Current
assumption,
or in foreseen.
the assumption you're making for AC36, but also the assumption you're making for all the developments that are going on, would be that they would be looked after at the moment by 3 services that are every 3 minutes, as opposed to a tram that's every 7 to 10 minutes.
Yes, we've been working with Auckland Transport now for a good couple of years to gradually improve the bus service, and that is the agreed strategy that was actually set, I don't know, 2012 or something. It is improved bus service until light rail in whatever form is implemented.
And my last quick question, Mr. Mayor, so around the cost and the options, if your board, because it's not our decision but we can give an indication, goes for option 3, technically it's kind of option 4, wouldn't it be, if we're spending a whole lot of money sinking in for 3 years? Surely we'd have to then spend the $6 million or so to then have a permanent service, and then another to connect to Britomart, which is not anywhere in their RLTP or anything?
As I said, the Panuku board will respect any decision you make about what you want to fund and prioritise it, but as the logic as it's seen by the board is, although it's there as an option, spending another couple of $1 million to take you through AC36 without thinking about what you're going to do next and realising there's the cost to that didn't seem logical to the board, because you're not going to get a lot, in reality, you're not going to get a lot of operating time out of this service. Even if all these works go to plan, the actual time will operate between today and AC36 will be constrained. And I've already made the comments about during the peak period of the event itself. So in the board's view, this was really a debate around, if we're going to keep putting money into this, we should be thinking of what's going to be a useful thing at the end, and that's the loop, if it has no use. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Lee.
Mr Mayor, I taking your advice to work out which is the most important question to ask, because I have so many. But
I suspected that.
I note the reference to the tramway not making money, and I think we've got a good idea why. Then again, most of our PT in Auckland doesn't make money. But putting that aside, what we expect to make money is commercial land transactions. And what I am concerned is the lack of due diligence in terms of suddenly, after all these years, you found that the tramway encroached, to use your report's words, on Mr Mark McGuinness of Willis Bond's new section, new land that you resurveyed for him, and then the cost of pulling out those tracks and possibly putting them back is not included in the deal. And what my question is, if any other developer in Auckland does damage to public property, or even cuts down a tree on their own property, quite often they have to make restitution as part of their development. And what I'm concerned about is, do you think it's normal that when you undertake a deal, and not only did you resurvey the land, but you approved a building which comes hard up against the boundary, which would forestall a solution like an easement? So do you think it's normal that costs that damage public property and public amenities, like the tramway or other amenities, should not be included and should not be restituted from the proceedings of what is meant to be a commercial deal?
Yeah, so normal practice, if we're selling a development site which has some work that needs to be done on it, in this case rather unusually moving some tram lines, but more typically contamination, which is the usual issue at the waterfront, the discussion with the developer entity is more along the lines of, well, we'll do it but then charge you for the full completed value, or we'll take a discounted price and you take the risk on the work. In this case, what's happened is that the developer paid full market value for the site, which would lead one to the view that neither party were necessarily aware at the time of the fact it would require the relocation. So there's no question that the public has received full fair value from the developer, and that if we're going to face some cost to do with like this tram line, it will be a cost to us. As far as building right up against the boundary line is concerned, that's quite correct, and that's following good urban design and planning advice to have an active edge at street level right up against the street. If you look at the apartment product that's gone in there now, you can see it's exactly the same thing. There is retail and food and beverage that has been built at ground floor to be as accessible as possible. So I come back to the point that even if all this had been discovered at the right time, all we would be doing is having this debate earlier, because Waterfront Auckland was always clear that the prime consideration was to get good quality spaces and development at the waterfront, which includes things like active edges, rationally shaped development sites. It's just we would have been having this debate earlier than we now are.
And popular place-making amenities. That's part of the development too, David.
Yes,
and you seem to have forgotten that, as well as doing proper due diligence when you do a land transaction.
Sorry, Councillor, the chance for speeches will be in a moment. Okay, that's good. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you. I actually feel quite sorry for you sitting before us wearing your Panuku hat right at the moment, and I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to the other multiple hats that you've worn over the years, including that as the most senior officer to oversee the development of the Britomart area, which I think has created so much value for Auckland in terms of the preservation of that heritage for all of those buildings that were to have been pulled down. So I don't want, in asking you this question, I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. I know that you know the economic value of heritage, but you are wearing a Panuku hat today. Coming to 16 of the report, the heritage trams were seen to provide an additional layer of to the urban fabric Wynyard Quarter, and originally there were suggestions of the tram link to Britomart Station on Tamaki Drive. Now, I have the advantage of having sat on the board of Auckland Transport, so I do know that there wasn't a resistance to that tram link being put there, because the original plans for light rail were for it to continue along the front of Britomart and up Queen Street.
Excuse me, Councillor,
and
can you
along
please
Quay
come to
Street.
the
So
question?
my question is, I think, and we discuss statements of intent later today, we are asking some hard questions of Panuku that should actually be hard questions also put to Auckland Transport. Because and the question is, what kind of dialogue has there been going right back to when there was the decision of this? It has been a tense point of negotiation, I know, between Auckland Transport, and would you recommend that we put these same hard questions, given that if there was to be an opportunity for the preservation, knowing the economic value it will bring to Auckland and heritage, what would you advise us if there is a willingness and we understand the costs? What advice would you give us in terms of those questions that could be posed to Auckland Transport? Because the reality is,
Okay,
there's no
sorry, I
public
think
transport
we've got
in
the,
Auckland
we've got
that
the
is
question.
not subsidised.
David, to reply, please.
So I think there's a heritage component to that question and a transport intentions question. Yes, it is correct on transport intentions that there was a lot of debate at the time around what was the appropriate public transport answer for the interior of the waterfront, if you like. And the conclusion of that debate was, as I said earlier, which is improving bus services and eventually what emerged was light rail, which Auckland Transport was responsible for, but the leadership of that has now moved to NZTA. But we have been advised the intention is still that the track will go along Fanshawe Street. And so you'll be aware that the current Wynyard crossing, which would be also need to be expensively upgraded if there was to be a rail service of any kind running through the waterfront. The replacement money that we have for that bridge in the LTP is not to produce a bridge capable of supporting a train service. So the Panuku board accepts the fact that as a result of the design work, that's the way that the regional transport requirements will best be met, and that it will be positive for the waterfront that it seems to be eventually intended that from Fanshawe Street there'll be a connection through the waterfront to a third harbour crossing, and we hope to obviously have a view about how that would be best integrated. From a heritage perspective, Panuku has inherited exactly the same commitment to heritage responsibilities as Waterfront Auckland had. In fact, live right now is a $2 million project which we championed with the Finance Committee late last year to restore the Voss shed, given that a trust that had undertaken to do the work was unable to fund it. There are also a number of other buildings that have been heritage buildings that have been expensively upgraded on the waterfront, the Lysart building, Mason Brothers. I mean, there's a very big commitment by the council group to Heritage on the Waterfront. And these trams which are from Melbourne, we're still proposing the two that don't go back to Melbourne will go to MOTAT. So the question around heritage really is, how much is there a heritage value in operating the trams on tracks that were put in 2011?
Thank you very much, David. Councillors, we now come to the discussion, the debate around the recommendation. I just want to test with councillors. I can move from the chair, or another councillor could choose to move it as an amendment. My feeling, just trying to gain the sense of councillors, is that a new recommendation along the lines that we receive the report from Panuku, because it's their report and ultimately their decision, receive the report from Panuku, but convey to the Panuku board that the preferred option of the governing body is option 3. Now, I can incorporate that as chair, or I can ask a councillor to move something along those lines. Councillor Lee?
Mr Mayor, Councillor Casey and I have put up an amendment worded exactly along those lines, and I'd invite you to look at it.
Have you tabled that with our...
Yes.
Okay.
And we're happy for you to move it, and we'll second you.
If that's fine, then I think we want to end up in the same place.
Yeah.
So shall I'll move it and then give it to, it's just in my handwriting at the moment, that we receive the report from Panuku, but convey to the Panuku board that the preferred option of the governing body is option 3. Now, not everybody will necessarily agree with that, but that gives us, I think, a different starting point than the current option. So I'll move that accordingly. Councillor Lee,
I'm happy to second it, Mr Mayor.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Okay, it's now open for comment, and I don't believe that there's nobody that wants to comment, but I've got nobody on my list.
Oh, here. Got some.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And it's been really good hearing, I wouldn't say sides, but the different arguments for and against and in between. I struggle with all of it really, but I think the thing around option 3, it listens to these people that have done a lot of work here and the idea of it. It's good in that regard, but I'm really mindful that you do a review after that year or 18 months when we haven't had a lot of options. We've also got America's Cup team saying they're not really interested in having all of that, but we're talking about having it for that. So that is a really conflicting argument. And I'm really mindful, if we do this and we review it, we're going to have to spend that money in the end. And, you know, we've got probably the same people that will vote for this now that voted to not sell service, you know, $5 million we forewent on Tuesday that could have helped pay for this. And so, you know, for me, it's about being sensible about money, and sometimes we get a bit caught up in the moment for each issue rather than seeing the bigger picture. So that, I do struggle with that, because we will, in the end, because of pressure, we'll do this. I know that Panuku's job is tasked with redeveloping that area, and they've done a fantastic job of getting, you know, companies who can sink millions and millions of dollars into this area, because we can't do it ourselves. So we're going to end up with a fantastic area. I'm a bit concerned about what we forego if we do this, what other opportunities, because it's really easy to look at this in a narrow view, but what other opportunities do we forego if we have to, and in the future will we have to keep moving this? You know, so that's an issue for me. I mean, I will support this, but I'm really mindful that, you know, we are struggling with money, and we've already foregone $5 million on Tuesday that Panuku would have had to help with this. But I will support it, Mr Chairman, because I do hear what these gentlemen have been saying, and you know, they have really good arguments. And let's give it a go, and hopefully the fact that we've got America's Cup busily happening doesn't kind of undermine what we're trying to do either, because we hear from Panuku that they're not that keen. But you know, let's give it a go in a different environment we have now than when it was started several years ago.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Filipaina. Sorry.
Sorry, my humble apologies.
We'll give you a minute.
We were just talking about trams.
I looked to the chair and there was nobody in it.
No, sorry. Your Worship, the question I asked our people when they came to in public forum, and I think for me, I will be supporting the recommendations up there. I was fortunate enough is that when the tram started there, when we brought them back to have on ride in them, and I mean, as one of our submitters said in South Auckland, when I spoke to him earlier before the meeting started, you know, I mean, we hear that South Auckland is you know, low socioeconomic, and we need to put money into South Auckland, and I totally agree. But for me, around the money that will be spent for these trams, from a South Auckland perspective, going there, and you mentioned a lady who worked at, was it Sofitel or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even, yeah, so look, Your Worship, I think this is a very good recommendation that Councillor Lee and others and yourself have worked on. So I congratulate Councillor Lee for this and just look forward to having another ride. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker, there's a precedent been set, Councillor, that people are not taking their full 5 minutes.
Sure.
But it's over to you. No pressure.
There are a couple of additions that myself and Councillor Watson have put up. I just want to reserve my right to speak to the substantive motion. And I'll just read them out. I know the officers have...
This is the substantive.
Sorry, this is now with the agreement of the mover of the proposed amendment, this is now the substantive motion.
Is it possible to add to the substantive motion?
You can move an amendment, but in which case you'd need to have the amendment up and to speak to that first.
Well, quite happy for the amendment to go up.
I'm sorry, there's some... Can I come back to you and you can sort out with our officers what your amendment is, and I'll just take some other comments in the meantime. Councillor Holtz.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'm very happy to support this. I'm going to echo some of the words of my colleague, Councillor Cooper. Yesterday, Councillor Cooper and I attended the beloved Dave Hare's funeral, and I raised that, and I know that he was a friend of yours as well. Dave personally, and with his own lovely hands, restored trams, and he instilled in us an absolute passion for trams as a valid and wonderful means of transport, and in fact his casket arrived on a tram at his funeral yesterday. So trams are fairly high up in our minds as we speak. But it's the heritage we love, and it's the love of trams and the possibility of this being an attraction. Where I think these two things have morphed together is trams as a valid transportation mechanism, and I think that's where, with the option 3, we've got a little bit of time to unpack with Auckland Transport how we integrate this into a valid transport option, because I think we can't morph the two together at the moment and pretend that we're investing 1.8 million and an ongoing series of OPEX funds into a transport option. So I think we need to signal that, even though it's not in the recommendation, that a very serious discussion needs to happen around transport in this area. We also need to remember, as we vote for this amount of money, which is a substantial amount of money, that we will forego some other activations in some other areas, and we've had councillors advocate strongly around this table for some of our other other local centres that are in desperate need of activation. So let's remember, this is another $1.8 million being spent in the city centre. So when we face that down with our communities, we have to be cognisant of that as well. I am really interested in the opportunities that have been talked about by our presenters at Open Forum about this being an attraction, and I think we need to look further at the opportunities for partnership with the private sector around activating this tram loop as an attraction. So, Mr Mayor, I thank you for finding a way forward for this. I think it's sensible, but I don't think the job is done. I think we've got an awful lot more discussion to have. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely true, Councillor. Thank you. I'll just wait 1 minute and then call you next, Councillor Walker, if I can, after Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I'm happy to support the recommendation. I personally feel a little bit blindsided by this, as I mentioned in my question. There are still a lot of questions I have. I don't know the reasons for the Waitemata Local Board asking for the tram to stay. There wasn't a copy of their letter in the document. I think my problem is in agreeing with the recommendation is the finances. And I think that it should be, the cost recovery should have probably come for this from the fact that you extended the boundary with the development and you've made extra money from that. And I haven't been able to ask my questions around that. So I support option 3, but I don't necessarily support the funding that is aligned with that support in the paper. So I want to make it quite clear that I think we need to test this. We don't know how this will go. I feel that, I don't like the report, sorry. I feel it hides a lot of stuff and doesn't give enough explanation around it. The fact that you ripped the tram lines up to make a better development and I didn't know about it, I just don't think it's quite right in my personal opinion. So I just want to make that, if it's an amendment, I don't know what the amendment is that's coming, but I do want to make it quite clear in support of this, I'm not supporting the fact that council, this body, has to grant Panuku extra money. I think they should find it themselves. They've made a mistake, and I believe that's the crux of this problem we have, and therefore, where Councillor Lee, and I haven't spoken to him about it, potentially is coming from. And so in my support, I do not support us giving Panuku any more money.
Perhaps I could take my call at this point because both Councillor Simpson and Councillor Hulse have made a point that I agree with. And Councillor Hulse said basically there's a lot of work still to be done on this. The reason that I've moved the motion that I have is because if we had simply accepted that option 4 was chosen, that's a drop-dead option. There are no other options. There is no other work. There are no other things to look at to see whether it could be made to work. And I don't know what to believe in terms of the figures. Any figures I get, actually, you know, there's one group, both assertions I'm sure are made in good faith, but they're both not right. But my feeling is, and probably addressing these comments to you, David, that what we need to do at this time is to sit down with you and work through what would result from if this governing body passes option 3. Because I think if we, you know, my gut feeling is we've never really given the tramway a proper go. And if we decide to rip it up, it's gone forever and we'll die wondering whether it might have been a great attraction. I'm not, I've got to say, convinced that it's a major transport mode, but there are some questions around that that we simply don't know the answer to yet. And one of them is whether these trams will be compatible in terms of the rail gauge with the new light rail that's being put in. And I've heard yes, no, maybe. And the truth is, we don't know yet. If it were compatible, then that opens up some, you know, the heritage trams in Melbourne run on the same rail as the new light rail. And they're a great part of the city's tram line. You go to Melbourne, you think, why the hell did we in 1956 demolish our trams when Melbourne didn't, and they're now running a successful system that integrates the heritage trams plus the new modern light rail. So I don't want to cut off that option yet until we have an answer. I do want to come back to the limit of the funding that we want to spend, and Councillor Cooper raised this. Every dollar we spend is not our dollar, it's a dollar belonging to the ratepayer. And, you know, there is a tendency around our table sometimes to vote for every expenditure item and never to vote to recover any capital or to raise revenue. And we can't do that responsibly. We can't do that responsibly. why option 3 appeals to me is that, yes, there's $1 million in tramline reinstatement. That's already booked. But if we're not prepared to accept that, then we have to accept that ripping up the tramline produced a fait accompli and we couldn't turn it around.
Correct.
And I'm not ready to do that. Now, I want to come back to the point of I'm a person that believes in the stuff-up theory of life and not the conspiracy theory. I don't think there was a conspiracy in the property transaction that was worked out, but if there wasn't a conspiracy, there was a stuff-up, David.
It's even worse.
Why didn't you know
that's worse.
that when... Well, no, it's one's malicious and one's accidental, and we all stuff up sometimes, Councillor. You know, not least of all you and me. But if you rip the line up, you can't then use that as the ground to say, oh, well, that's going to cost more money if we put it back. Because that was ripped up in the anticipation it would be put back, and the money is there for it. So what we're looking at is the net cost being less than that. It won't be operating for the full period of time because we've got to wait for the thing to be reinstated. So the OPEX will be limited. The overall cost is the dispute between yourself and the organisations that have made representations to us. I think we need to explore those figures more carefully because I don't know which set of figures I can properly rely on. But I do want, and I don't accept, let me say this very clearly, I do not accept that we're signing up to a 5.9 million capex in a new tram barn. That is a decision for the future. This doesn't bind us at all in that regard. I want to make one other point, and it comes to Councillor Walker's amendment, which he has now withdrawn, but I had some sympathy for some of the points involved in it.
It can still go up?
No, I'm happy to accept that you've withdrawn it, Councillor, but I'm trying to give you some credit here.
Okay.
And that is, if we're going to run, I said before, we've never really given this tramline a proper go, and I believe that. And we've never had somebody running the tramline that has some expertise to do so. So what I'd like to, and it comes to your amendment, Councillor, and I think we need to explore this in discussions with Panuku, is that we need to look at an alternative operating model. I think you're absolutely right. And if this is going to be run, let's have a look at what they've done in Christchurch and in other places. Give it to somebody and say to them, you've got the opportunity to prove whether you can make a go of this. And I believe that you can. With the Wynyard Quarter in its full development, it will be a magnet for people coming from all over the country, the city and the world. And this can be part of it if it's run well. And I've seen it in Christchurch, you know, where at nights the tram becomes a travelling restaurant. I don't know what you pay to sit on that travelling restaurant, probably a shed load of money, as Councillor Holst would say.
Too bad.
But, you know, there are different ideas to explore. And that's why I don't want option 4, because it says it's dead, it's gone, even without it being properly trialled. We do know in 2011, at one point, we were making, what, $52,000 a month. Now, I don't know, Panit and I had a slight difference of view on that. I don't know whether that was an outlier or whether it can become a norm. But I don't want to destroy the tram without giving it a fair go. And that's why I've moved the resolution. And I just want to finish by reiterating the point. This resolution is not the end of everything. The Panuku board has the ability to make a decision. I think, David, that they will be willing to come back and talk to the governing body around what the sentiment that we have shown, and the vote will determine whether that is an overwhelming sentiment or the sentiment doesn't exist. My sense is that most people want to give it a go, but most people don't want to put a whole lot of extra money into a capital development until we've trialled it fairly. If it works and it runs on its own merit. If it doesn't work, you draw the line under it. So that's why I've moved changed the resolution to what I have. Councillor Walker, I think it's only fair that I should now give you a chance to have your comments.
You stole a lot of my thunder, Mr. Mayor, but that's okay. Happy with that.
He's the boss.
And yes, I'm entirely supportive of the option that we're considering. I guess my big concern is around contestable advice. It's very clear that there's an alternative operating model. It's clear, I would suggest, that there is an alternative funding model, and that could include leveraged transactions from developers. It's clear to me that there are alternative costings, and I know the costings that, frankly, I think are more credible. I'd suggest there's an alternative around this advice around the America's Cup steering group, and I'd like to explore that alternative, and I think that's very important and it's urgent. And I'd suggest that there's certainly an alternative view around what could be and will be a resoundingly successful project based on huge numbers of people in this catchment living, playing and working. So I'd suggest there's a complete alternative around what should be an immensely successful project that is vital for Auckland.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I just take out of order Councillor Fletcher, because I think she has to leave for another engagement. Councillor Fletcher.
I do. I have to leave for the 100th birthday party of Olive Stoddard.
Give her my best.
Olive Stoddard, at age 100, is still supporting 39 charities in Auckland and was a great supporter of the America's Cup, and I know also a great supporter of trams, so it's highly appropriate that I should be heading off there today. May I commence by really acknowledging the Mayor for putting up option 3. It is absolutely appropriate. Councillor Cooper was talking about opportunities forgone, but what opportunities would we forgo if we close that option off today? And I really do want to applaud Councillor Lee for his consistency, his advocacy and his passion for this. He has been right the way through consistent, and I do think that we need to have a joint meeting between Auckland Transport and Panuku. This is not going to work unless we get Auckland Transport's buy-in. You heard from the submitters earlier today, this won't work unless the hop card is actually going to be able to be used with this. You know, this is really requiring a much more integrated approach, and it is one of those occasions, and as a supporter of CCOs, when it's kind of at the interface. And so I would really hope that we can actually bring them together. The whole initiative here was really around what was envisaged for the waterfront. Now, we as a body have actually deviated from what were the original plans, and we've done it in one forum, and now in this forum we're saying, oh, it's all a big surprise. But the reality is that it was anticipated that there would be a continuation. As you came along the waterfront, there was going to be the ability to continue down Quay Street. And I am one of those who really believes that people and trams, and I know that Councillor Lee has been a champion of this, people and trams go together. I also believe that when it comes to heritage, we need to see adaptive reuse. It isn't any good just putting something in a museum. It's about actually seeing it in operation, seeing it used effectively, understanding the history of our city and how it is also our future. I do feel disappointed in the decisions that we have taken that have actually removed the decision-making ability. Yes, it might allow us a little bit more flexibility around the financial side of things, but I think it's a shame that NZTA now are calling the shots, and I hope we never allow that to happen in terms of the port, because I think we do need to be able to keep control of our own waterfront and our own destiny on some of these things. But acknowledgement must go to the Mayor today for the fact that he has championed option 3. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't all sorts of opportunities for partnerships, for sponsorship, and for ways in which we can relieve the burden of the ratepayer on this one. I think as a standalone initiative, it's got all sorts of possibilities, but I also believe that it will be, if we require it of Auckland Transport, part of the mode of transport that people will use along the waterfront. And I would hope that we can have a workshop or a committee meeting with Panuku, with Auckland Transport in the short term, and this will not be workable unless there is the HOP card to accompany it. So congratulations to Councillor Lee, to the champions that have been here of the trams, and to yourself for moving away from the recommendations of the governing body report and into something that is much more pragmatic and I think visionary for the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and please pass on our happy 100th to
Olive Stoddart.
Yeah. Councillor Richard Hills.
Thank you, Chair. I admire the passion and the information that's come forward from our earlier presenters, so thank you. My position on this is purely a transport one, and from what our presenters said around potentially using this instead of the buses or whatever, there's discussion around the table that it's an attraction, but then others are using it as a transport mode, and I can't see this in the way it is being used as a transport mode. The buses down there are every 3 to 4 minutes. This loop is this tram, if there's two, is every 7 to 10 minutes. And I think that expecting people coming from St Luke's or Kingsland or the CityLink or the 75, which is Remuera and Meadowbank and the other areas around there, to get off at Victoria Park and then walk a considerable way to a connection that is slower than the current buses and the buses that connect Britomart already. I have some concerns about. This wasn't envisaged in the RLTP, and we didn't discuss it with our plans for the waterfront. We didn't discuss it on the plans for the City Centre Master Plan. We haven't discussed it on the AC36. So in isolation, I feel it's strange, and I also have a worry that even option 3, which, you know, everyone can argue about the figures, but there will be costs and they could be millions. Just to do it for 3 years, that's more sunken money into this, when then I think it's clear we would have to then progress to the option which is 5 to 7 million or more, because it wouldn't make sense, in my opinion, doing this now and then not continuing on. We know that we can't take trams across where the Tiriwero bridge is, due to the fact it would have to be constantly down, or there would have to be a new bridge built. And we're getting over 1.5 million people walking across that bridge at the moment already, and we're building public spaces there. So, and the discussions I've had around potential for North Shore Rail is that it would be on Fanshawe, and it wouldn't be making a dogleg through the Wynyard Quarter, and it would be connecting to the buses now, which have just increased their use around there. So I do have a worry that this is not a value for money at all, and everyone around here continues to go on about value for money and wasted ratepayers' money, and simply saying that Panuku should find the money, it's still ratepayers' money no matter where it comes from. And the other thing is, we give Panuku a lot of crap for not making money or not doing their developments or being slow on their work program, but then when they make development decisions to try and get the best value for money for the ratepayer and for the developments and the best design and urban design, which is everything in our the SOI and letters of expectation is about that, then we give them crap for that. So I'm all about, finding out more information, and probably would be good to have a lot more here, but in my perspective, that I cannot see, and also if we want it to be an efficient service, it would need to be at least 7 to 7 down there, 7 days a week, which would definitely mean at least $200,000 worth of drivers' wages, and that's at $20 an hour, plus all the other costs that come to it, and I just don't see it as a viable service. Maybe as a commercial, yes, but then if that commercial service slows down the actual whole services that have been promised down there for everything else that's going on, we will be doing things like closing that space during the America's Cup, and I even saw it, the issues that came when the Duke and Duchess were there a few weeks ago, of when you've got a lot of people down there, you need to start redirecting traffic. We can't redirect in this way unless you spend a lot more money on new tracks. I just can't see it working. So my opinion is nothing to do with the personalities, it's nothing to do with the politics, it's just for me as a transport and everything we're investing down there and asking you guys to invest and do the work, it seems counterintuitive to me to be doing this now if we're not going to invest the big money to make sure it's right. So I think this decision today means the future decision will be that really expensive option. So otherwise, why would we waste the money on the half option? So it's either or for me, and I couldn't support the higher option. So I'm sorry, I won't be supporting this, but I'm happy to keep listening, and it sounds like it's going to win, but I just feel it's a non-workable situation in my opinion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your leadership on this. Councillor Casey and myself had an amendment which includes what you put up now, and I have to confess was a bit long-winded and wordy, and you've come straight to the point. What we were saying, adding was consequential to our preference for option 3, and just as Councillor Walker's recommendations are consequential to that, and we will discuss that at the appropriate time. I want to thank Panuku. I want to praise Panuku, actually, and Waterfront Auckland for the way they have run the waterfront trams, the dock line trams up until now. I want to thank Connie Clarkson and James Duncan, who've been so passionate and dedicated about running the trams, but it seems it's quite evident, and I'm very sad to hear it, but senior management doesn't have the same vision, and so that opens the door, I guess, to other options. I would prefer it stayed where it was, because I believe that the heritage tramway and place shaping is very much a part of the mission for Waterfront Auckland, Panuku Auckland development. Members have raised the important question of cost, and that was in the addendum to our recommendation. First of all, it noted that the operational cost of the tramway has been allocated by the governing body in the 2018-2028 long-term plan at the request of Panuku. The money for the OPEX is there. Now the CAPEX is a little bit problematic, and we all make mistakes, as the Mayor has pointed out. However, it's a matter of learning from them and fixing those errors rather than compounding. Any land deal, any commercial land deal must wash its own face. And there's lots and lots of figures in here, and we've heard figures from the tram experts, or Jeff Groban in particular, who is a genuine expert in light rail and trams, and he's got figures which are somewhat more modest, a third of Panuku's figures, but in terms of costs. However, one figure we haven't heard is how much Panuku got for selling that land, and I don't want to hear it actually, but I'm sure it'll be confidential, so we don't want to go there. However, I would make the point, any business transaction must restitute the costs of that transaction. If you do a deal with that nice man from Wellington and you change the boundaries, and then there's, through an oversight, the tramway is found to encroach, not the other way around, on that property, then the costs of that must be paid out of that revenue. That's how business people in the real world do things. Anyway, I won't go on about that. What I want to remind members is the last time the public Aucklanders were let in on this deal, on this Wynyard Point, on this waterfront, was the waterfront plan. It was well supported, and there was tons of submissions, and they were very constructive. And the waterfront plan was a good plan, and contrary to what some members understand, the Heritage Tramway was featured throughout in graphics and in words throughout that plan, but there was, as part of the consultation, which was thoroughgoing, was are questions about the future of that tramway. And the original idea was that the tramway, as Councillor Fletcher reminded us, would link across Quay Street to Britomart, picking up the Maritime Museum, picking up Princess Wharf, picking up what is now the North Shore Bus Terminal, and of course Queen's Wharf and Britomart. And Waterfront Auckland and Auckland Council said to the people of Auckland, what do you think about that idea? Should we get that tramway across? And 43% of respondents said, do it now, 2012. And 30% said, do it soon. And 13% said, do it later. And 13% said, we don't support it at all. So that makes it 87% of Aucklanders thought it was a good idea not only to keep the tramway, but to extend it along the waterfront. But whether we do or not...
Councillor, can I just get you to wind up, please?
Okay, well, I'm winding up now, Mr Mayor. Whether we do or not is up to us, not consultants. This is a major strategic question for Auckland, and the Mayor and the governing body, working as a team, need to get across these key decisions rather than being passive recipients of other people's ideas, because we're the people in touch with the public, and we're the people the public expect us to meet their aspirations. There's one point I want to make about heritage, because Mr Rankin has cast doubt on the validity of the heritage of those old trams. We've had 100-year-old Auckland trams going down that circuit, but I don't want to quibble about it, but I'll just say in terms of the America's Cup, that's heritage, but you'll find that all the technology is leading edge, changing all the time, but it's still heritage. And since Plastic Fantastic in 1987, it's part of our heritage. It's originally America's heritage and Britain's heritage and even Australia for a time, but it's very much part of our heritage. And just like the waterfront trams, they were put in there in 2011, but they evoke the heritage of an older Auckland, and they speak.
Thank you, Councillor. You've exhausted your time and your extension now.
Thank you.
Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, and I want to thank you for your supporting this and agree with the sentiments that you expressed, and also to Mike Lee for his advocacy. Actually, I'm thinking about a constituent of mine, Len Brown, because Len Brown, and look, I had my differences with Len over the years, but he was an advocate of this, and I feel I'm channeling him in reflecting my comments this morning. There has been some discussion this morning around the capital cost as well as the operating costs. I've heard different sets of numbers. I find myself actually falling down on the side of Mr Rankin. I agree with him that there is an ongoing operating deficit that is likely to emerge from this. I don't know if you could find a single public transport service that does wipe its face. They are subsidised for a good reason. They are subsidised because they are considered to be essential services that need to be contracted. Now, this is not, from what I understand, going to be in the regional public transport plan, although there are some who would like it to be a contracted service for that. It's a bit different from that, but you can't find public transport services, well, I can't find them, that are actually able to turn a dollar into break even on commercial terms. I listened to what Councillor Hill said. I have some sympathy for what he said. I think if you were to take the argument to its logical conclusion, though, we wouldn't do Skypath. That is going to have to receive significant financial support, and for good reason, because if it didn't have that, it wouldn't happen, but it should be supported because there is value to it. There are many different projects that are in the same category. I guess here in relation to this, I look at this as an opportunity for some place shaping, and I do reflect on the contribution that trams make in cities like San Francisco, which to me is the exemplar. What a shame, frankly, that this tram service will only operate at this particular location. The best tram service anywhere, I think, is the tram service in the Embarcadero in San Francisco. What a shame that we couldn't have this along Quay Street. This would be a wonderful addition to that part of the city. However, Your Worship, I want to thank the presenters that have come and pitched today. I want to acknowledge the challenge that has been outlined by Panuku, and ultimately, in voting for this, I recognise that if we sign up to this cost, it will be an ongoing cost, and that's what people do have to realise. So we can continue the conversation, Chair, but I'll vote for this, but I do understand that there is a financial implication, and it will be an implication that will be worn by ratepayers.
Thank you very much. Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Well, look, I'm too also a most reluctant traveller in support of this motion, because I think there's some aspects of this that are quite worrying, and I think while we've turned the hose on a little bit here, there's a long way, a lot of water to go under the bridge on this one to see this be anything past the period that is identified there. And thanks to the team, thanks to the submitters that have come in here today. But, we often remind ourselves to make our decisions around this table based on previous decisions, based on decisions on strategic directions that we've taken. And probably one of those references that we should take a look at is the Waterfront Plan from 2012 and our most recent refresh. And I invite you members to have a look at that, and you won't see a single mention of this project there.
Because it never went to the public.
In 2011, this project was put in place. I wasn't here at this council then, not aware of it, but in 2012, a well-socialised 2012 waterfront plan was put out, without doubt. And it is not mentioned there.
It is mentioned there.
It's not mentioned in the connectivity section at all. You can't see it on the plan. And there has been some reference to rapid transit tracking towards Quay Street. That was work to be further explored, and the plan makes it quite explicit. We've just had a workshop and a meeting on the Regional Public Transport Plan. This, if it is a transport solution, was not raised at that meeting. I chaired that workshop. No one raised this at that meeting. Now, I invite you to make a submission to the Regional Public Transport Plan or raise it again so that we could maybe jointly make a submission, but it was definitely not referred to. So there are two strategic documents where it is entirely absent, and I remind you of that. So we rely on others to give us advice, and while the Waitemata Local Board has given us some advice here, it would have been good to see their letter in more detail, and I invite the Panuku board to look into that a bit more. But we haven't sought the advice of the City Centre Advisory Board. The City Centre Advisory Board has spent considerable targeted rate in this area. It should be asked its opinion. It is an advisory board. I'd be very surprised, like my colleague from the North Shore, Councillor Hills, if the rapid transit study, which is now underway as a matter of urgency, looking at route and route protection for the rapid transit connection to the North Shore, goes through the middle of the Wynyard Quarter, as Mr. Rankin's identified. It's very likely that it is more to the west Beaumont Street. I don't think North Shore light rail users in the future are going to be very interested in a quick whip around the block at Wynyard on their way to work in the city centre. And that's what they would be doing by this plan. There's been questions about the heritage importance. I've sent an email to a heritage manager saying, can you give us some background on the heritage values of this? We don't have any on file. Might go to MOTAT and find them there. I invite Panuku to look at the heritage values when you bring it to the to the board again, the board now needs to really understand not the anecdotal heritage values, but the true heritage values that are actually registered, because I'm struggling with that. There's been some mention of the success of other heritage trams, and then I looked up the Christchurch tram, and yep, that's not $2.50, that's 10 times that price, it's $25 a head. So, look, I guess there's a number of things that need to be looked at here. Mr. Rankin, I invite your board to look at the road safety issues that you highlighted when you were discussing the America's Cup options on the, I think it was the Halsey-Jellicoe intersection. I asked about the risk of conflict there with people when we were considering the America's Cup locations, and you, at that time, I think it was yourself or Mr. Marler, said, yes, there were some things, there were risks in that location, the conflict of people and logistics coming on to the America's Cup base. So I think the board needs to look at that and examine the logistics and the road safety issues there. And the other one is to look at seeking an expression of interest for a private commercial operator if this does all stack up. And I welcome the door knocking on your door, of course not mine, of those parties who really do want to put their hand up to pay for this. And if it's commercially viable, go for it. But ultimately, I actually want to see an evidence-based case, a business case, come to the Panuku board. Because at this time and in this report, I'm not viewing in front of me an evidence-based business case. So I hope in your final report writing, your board members do see that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We've got 2 more speakers to go. Councillor John Watson.
Oh, no thanks.
Okay, great. That's even better. Councillor Ross Clow.
Yes, I actually just have really a question, some questions of David at this stage. I'm sorry about that, but I don't want to speak otherwise. I just want to know, well, I'll frame it a different way then. So David, I have concerns about this. I'm going to vote for it, but I have concerns very much based around, similar to what Councillor Hills has. But I've been quite heartened by the fact that the presenters seem to be more than willing to set up a trust and take on the responsibility, the financial responsibility, and indeed maybe leasing this. Is that viable? Will you be doing that, exploring that with them over the next few months? Because I think it's great. People want to step up and take that responsibility. And it's maybe they can make it work as they're indicating they can.
I think it's probably out of order to ask questions at this phase, but that is the sort of thing that I imagine will happen in the follow-up discussions, Councillor. It's a very good point. Understand where you're coming from. We have had an offer from our presenters earlier in the day. I think it's a genuine offer. I think they're enthusiastic to try to make this work, and we should harness that enthusiasm. So but we won't take it as a question.
I know, I'm just trying to reinforce that offer.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I knew exactly what you were trying to do. We've got the motion in front of us. It's just been expanded out to say what option 3 is. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no.
No, sorry.
Okay, I declare it overwhelmingly carried. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now 12:07. We've made slow progress, but this, first of all, thank you to the officers, and we'll be looking forward to having that discussion and involving the folk at the back of the room in how we can get the best chance of making this work, give it our best shot. Right.